The wind came whispering down from the mesas that morning, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and the faint smoke of a distant fire. The little settlement of Dry Creek lay quiet in the valley below, just a scatter of weathered cabins, a blacksmith shed, and a church whose bell hadn't rung since the last funeral. Folks there lived slow and worked hard, speaking little and trusting even less. It was the kind of place where every stranger's step was counted, and every whisper traveled faster than the wind. But that morning, something strange stirred in the hush between sunrise and full day, a sound, a presence, or maybe a sign. No one could quite tell. Only later would they say that was when everything began to change. At the edge of town, near the dry riverbed where cottonwoods twisted their pale arms to the sky, a rider appeared. He came without warning, silent as a shadow, his pony kicking up red dust with every tired step. His face was dark from sun and wind, his long hair bound with a strip of rawhide. He was Apache, though no one said the word out loud. In Dry Creek, such a man didn't come near unless he had reason, and no good reason ever came easy. He rode until he reached the well that stood behind the trading post, slid down from his saddle, and dipped his hands in the cool water. For a moment he closed his eyes. The trail behind him had been long, marked by blood and silence. He wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. Maybe peace, maybe forgiveness. But he knew he couldn't go back. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what he'd done. From the porch, an old man named Hal watched him with narrow eyes. Hal had lived long enough to know trouble when it crossed his road, and he felt it now, crawling up from his gut like the rattle of a snake. He didn't say a word, just spat into the dirt and turned back inside. Folks in town would hear soon enough that an Apache had come down from the hills, and once they did, they'd talk about rifles and revenge. But not everyone in Dry Creek had a gun in hand or hate in their heart. In the cabin near the well, a young woman was kneeling beside a broken chair leg, mending it as the morning light slanted through the cracks in her shutters. She'd come west with her father after her mother passed, and though she carried the look of someone gentle, there was a steel quietness in her eyes that made most men look twice and keep their distance. Her father had been gone for 2 weeks, chasing rumors of gold beyond the San Pedro hills, leaving her to tend the house and the few chickens scratching out back. When she heard the sound of hooves and saw the man at the well, she froze. For a long moment she didn't breathe. Then she stepped to the window, hand hovering near the old rifle hanging by the door. The stranger didn't look up. He was kneeling still, his hands in the water as though it carried something sacred. She didn't know what made her step outside. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper she couldn't name. The wind tugged at her hair as she walked toward him. The man rose slowly, sensing her before he saw her. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers across the sunlight. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "You're far from your people." He nodded, his voice low and rough when he finally answered, "I've been gone too long to call any place mine." Something in his tone made her chest tighten, though she didn't understand why. There was sadness in it, deep and old like the land itself. She glanced at his hands, noticing the faint red stain that the water hadn't fully washed away. "You're hurt," she said. "It's not my blood," he replied, his eyes flicking toward the hills. Her throat went dry. She wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes warned her to leave it alone. Before she could turn back, a gust of wind caught the edge of her skirt, sweeping dust around them both. It was then, so small and quick a thing it might have been missed, that her fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, accidental, yet in that instant something strange passed between them. The air seemed to shift. The steady hum of the cicadas broke off. The sound of the wind faded to nothing. It was as though time itself held its breath. He felt it, like a spark leaping through his skin and sinking straight into his chest. She felt it too, a jolt that stole her balance and sent a shiver racing up her arms. Their eyes met again, wide and uncertain. "You touched something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you feel it?" He looked down at his hand, still damp, still shaking faintly. "What did I touch?" She stepped back, her face pale, eyes fixed not on him but on the earth where their shadows met. "Not me," she murmured. "Something else. Something older." He followed her gaze. The ground between them was cracked and dry, but there, half hidden in the dust, lay something small. An old charm of woven leather and bone, sun-bleached and frayed. He didn't remember dropping it, yet it looked as though it had been waiting there for him all along. The charm was Apache-made, but of a kind his people no longer spoke of. His grandmother once told him such things were not to be touched unless one was ready to lose what could never be found again. He hadn't believed her then, but now staring at it, he felt a strange weight settle on his heart, like a memory calling from far away. The woman took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not meant to be found," he swallowed hard. "Then why was it waiting for me?" She shook her head slowly. "Some things wait for the one who's already lost." The words sent a chill through him. He wanted to ask what she meant, but before he could, a sharp cry echoed from the ridge above the town. A rider appeared against the sunlight, galloping hard. The man's hand went to the knife at his belt out of instinct, but the woman caught his arm. "Don't," she said quickly. "That's my father's friend. If he sees you," but it was too late. The rider had seen them both. He pulled his horse up short, raising a hand to shade his eyes. "You there," he called out. "Step away from her!" The Apache took a single step back, his muscles tight as a drawn bowstring. He didn't reach for his weapon, but the danger hung between them, sharp and humming. The woman turned toward the rider, trying to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The air felt heavier now, the silence between them louder than gunfire. The rider shouted again, and in that moment, the Apache's gaze dropped once more to the charm lying in the dust. It glimmered faintly in the sun, as though breathing. Against every instinct, he bent and picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, the wind rose with a sudden wail that tore through the valley. The church bell, untouched for years, gave a single deep toll that rolled like thunder through Dry Creek. He froze. The woman stared at him, fear flashing across her face. "What did you do?" she cried. He looked down at the charm in his palm. The bones within it had begun to darken, pulsing faintly, as though something inside was waking. And in that instant, he understood the truth too late. He hadn't just touched a trinket from his past. He had touched something alive, something ancient, something that now had hold of him. The rider spurred his horse forward, shouting her name. She reached out as if to stop him, her eyes wide with terror, but the Apache didn't move. He could only stare at the charm burning in his hand, feeling his heartbeat twist and falter. He tried to let go, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The wind screamed through the valley, whipping the dust into a storm. The world spun, and somewhere in that roaring emptiness, he heard a whisper not of this earth, calling his name, promising something terrible and beautiful. He looked up at her one last time, his eyes hollow with shock, and right there, in the heart of Dry Creek, under the wide and merciless sky, the Apache felt his soul slip from him, drawn into something unseen, something that would not let go. The wind fell silent. The charm stopped pulsing, and when he looked again, she was gone. The dust slowly settled over Dry Creek, coating the air in a haze that blurred the edges of the world. For a long while, the Apache stood there alone, the strange charm clenched in his hand, feeling the weight of something he could not name pressing down on his chest. The sound of the rider's hooves faded into the distance, and with it went the last trace of the woman's voice. She was gone, vanished as if the wind itself had carried her away. He turned in every direction, calling out softly, but only the echoes of his own breath answered him. The sun was slipping westward, bleeding gold through the clouds, and he knew then that Dry Creek was not an ordinary place. He slid the charm into the leather pouch tied to his belt. Though it seemed to hum faintly against his side, as though resisting being hidden, he wanted to throw it away, bury it, anything. But something deep inside warned him that whatever power it held would follow him if he tried. He mounted his horse and turned toward the hills, but the beast shifted uneasily beneath him, snorting and tossing its head. The animal's eyes rolled white, and no amount of tugging on the reins could calm it. That was when he felt it again, the faint vibration beneath the ground like the heartbeat of something buried deep. He dismounted slowly, crouched low, and pressed his palm to the earth. The soil was warm, pulsing faintly in rhythm with his own heart. He whispered something in Apache under his breath, an old prayer meant to keep the restless spirits at bay. His grandmother had taught it to him when he was a boy, saying the land remembered everything: blood, laughter, sorrow, and sometimes it spoke back. He had never believed it until now. By the time he returned to his small camp near the riverbed, the light had dimmed to copper. He built a small fire and sat close to it, rubbing his palms together as the wind shifted and the coyotes began their distant calls. Sleep did not come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face. Her frightened eyes, her pale lips, the tremor in her voice when she said, "You touched something." He wondered if she was real or if his mind, frayed by too many nights on the trail, had conjured her up from loneliness and guilt, but the charm said otherwise. He took it from the pouch and held it close to the firelight. Its bones gleamed faintly, arranged in a spiral pattern woven with what looked like horsehair. It was old, older than his lifetime, older than the white men's arrival, maybe older than the stories themselves. Yet when he turned it, the bones seemed to shift on their own, realigning like something alive. He dropped it back into the dirt and backed away. The fire flickered as though the air itself had grown tight. A whisper came then, soft and low, rising from nowhere and everywhere all at once. He froze, every muscle in his body locked. The sound wasn't in any tongue he knew, but he understood it all the same. It wasn't words exactly, but a feeling, a call pulling at him from far beneath the ground. He wanted to move, to leave, but his legs wouldn't listen. The wind lifted suddenly, blowing the fire sideways, and in the brief light he saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, her dress ghostly pale in the dark, her hair wild around her face. She didn't move or speak. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight. He opened his mouth to call her name, but no sound came. Then, as quick as the wind's turn, she was gone again, only the whisper of leaves where she had been. He stayed awake until dawn, waiting, half hoping she might return. But the sun rose clean and sharp, and with it came the cold realization that he was being drawn into something he didn't understand. The charm pulsed once more faintly against his side like a living heart. That morning, the town began to stir with talk. Old Hal told the others what he'd seen: the Apache by the well, the girl standing beside him, the strange gust that had torn through the air. "It was like the earth itself was breathing," he muttered over coffee at the general store. And when it stopped, the girl was gone. By noon, word had spread through every cabin and shopfront. Some said the Apache had stolen her. Others whispered that she had vanished by witchcraft. The preacher spoke of sin and curses, claiming that Dry Creek had been built on ground that was never meant to be tamed. The girl's father, when he returned from the hills that evening, was a broken man, his voice hoarse, his eyes hollow, as he demanded answers that no one could give. A search party was formed. They rode out past the well, through the riverbeds and into the canyons, calling her name. The Apache watched from a ridge above, hidden among the rocks. He wanted to shout that he hadn't harmed her, that he'd seen her vanish before his eyes, but he knew they wouldn't believe him. To them, he was a stranger, a shadow in their world, carrying the mark of a people they feared. When night fell again, he rode deeper into the hills, following the faint pull he felt through the charm. The sky above was vast and black, filled with stars so close they looked like they could burn the skin if touched. Somewhere in the distance, a storm grumbled over the horizon, its lightning flashing across the plains. He felt the air grow colder with each step his horse took, and soon he came upon a place that made his breath still: the ruins of an old mission, long abandoned and half buried by sand. The stones were cracked, the wooden beams splintered by years of wind and rain, yet the bell still hung above the archway, tilted and broken. He dismounted slowly, stepping through the fallen doorway. The air inside smelled of dust and faint smoke. And then he saw it, etched into the floor beneath the broken altar, the same spiral pattern that marked the charm. His heart thudded. He knelt, tracing the shape with his fingers. The stone was warm, though no light touched it. As he did, the whispering began again, soft at first, then rising until it filled the room like a song. This time he heard her voice among the echoes. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said, faint and trembling, as if from far away. "It doesn't belong to this world anymore." He turned, searching the shadows. "Where are you?" he shouted. His voice echoed back, smaller, weaker. "I tried to stop you," the voice went on. "It woke because of you." His hands clenched. "Tell me what it is." The wind swept through the ruins, stirring the dust into spirals. For a moment, he thought he saw her standing in the doorway again, her outline flickering like candlelight. "The charm wasn't meant to be found," she whispered. "It binds what cannot die." Then her form flickered and she was gone again. He sank to his knees, breathing hard. If this was some spirit or curse, he had to understand it. His people's stories told of things buried in the desert, spirits bound by the old ones to keep balance between the living and the lost. Maybe that was what this charm was, a seal broken by accident, and now something ancient was awake again. But what did it want from him? The night stretched on, restless and wild. He made camp near the ruins, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. When the fire burned low, he felt a new presence in the darkness, different from before, colder, heavier. A shadow moved beyond the light's edge, tall and still, like a man made of smoke. Its outline shimmered, and as the Apache stared, it raised its head. He whispered a prayer and reached for the charm. It burned hot in his palm. The shadow flinched but didn't vanish. Instead, it spoke, not in words but in thoughts that struck his mind like thunder. "You called me." He shook his head. "No," he whispered aloud. "I didn't mean to, too late. The bond is made." The fire guttered, and in that brief moment of darkness, he saw flashes, visions of the past, of men digging into sacred ground, of blood soaking into sand, of the same charm being buried beneath the earth long ago. And then he saw her, the woman, standing beside that grave, tears on her face as she pressed the earth closed. The vision faded. The fire flared back to life and the shadow was gone. The Apache sat trembling, his breath ragged. The charm had gone still again, cold now against his skin. He stared into the flames until dawn painted the sky gray. When he finally rose, he knew there was no turning back. The charm had bound him to something older than sin, and the girl, whatever she had become, was tied to it as well. Somewhere in the desert, the truth waited, buried deep, and he had no choice but to follow where it led. Far off in Dry Creek, the church bell tolled once more, though no hand had touched it. The townsfolk crossed themselves and whispered that evil had come down from the hills. But one old woman, hearing that faint sound, only looked toward the horizon and murmured, "No, not evil, not yet." And somewhere between heaven and dust, the wind carried a single cry, half human, half lost, calling the Apache by name. The morning sun rose over the ridges like a blade of fire, cutting the shadows from the land. But the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled in the Apache's bones. He stood beside the remains of his campfire, the ashes still faintly smoking, and watched the horizon turn gold. The charm hung from his neck now, heavy against his chest. It no longer pulsed, but he could feel it there, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Every now and then it gave a faint tremor, reminding him that whatever he'd awakened wasn't done with him yet. He saddled his horse in silence and turned toward the valley, where the faint outlines of Dry Creek shimmered in the distance. He didn't want to return, but something drew him back. Maybe it was the woman, her voice still echoing in his mind. Or maybe it was the strange pull of unfinished fate. The land around him seemed different now, sharper, alive in a way it hadn't been before. The air hummed faintly with something he couldn't name. Even the birds stayed quiet. As he rode, he saw the search party again. They were moving slow through the brush, their faces tight with suspicion. At the front rode the woman's father, his clothes dusty, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He carried a rifle slung across his saddle and looked like a man who wouldn't hesitate to use it. The Apache watched them from a rise hidden among the rocks. He could hear fragments of their voices carried by the wind. "She didn't run off," one of them said. "Something took her. Or someone," the father replied, his tone sharp and cold. The words hit like stones. The Apache's jaw tightened. He could have ridden away then, left the valley, gone where no one would find him, but that wouldn't change what had happened. If he left, she'd be lost forever. And deep down, he knew that what had taken her wasn't something that bullets could stop. By midday, he reached the outskirts of town. The few people he passed stared hard but didn't speak. He could feel their fear like heat in the air. When he stopped at the well, the same one where he'd first seen her, the old man Hal stepped out of the trading post, rifle in hand. "You best not linger here," Hal said, voice low but steady. "They're looking for someone to blame." "I'm not here for trouble," the Apache replied. Hal studied him, squinting against the light. "That's so. Funny thing, trouble seems to follow you like a hungry dog. The girl's gone, her pa's half mad, and folks say the wind cried her name last night. You tell me that don't mean something." The Apache didn't answer. He drew a slow breath and looked toward the church at the end of the road. Its doors were closed, but a faint tolling sound drifted from inside, too soft for any living hand to have caused. Hal's gaze followed his. "If I were you," he said, "I'd leave before the sun sets. Whatever's walking out there, it ain't done yet." The Apache nodded once and walked on. He didn't go to the church, not yet. Instead, he crossed the Dry Creek bed and climbed the slope beyond, where he could look down over the whole town. The charm grew warm again, and he felt that strange pull. Southward this time, toward the edge of the desert where the rocks glowed red under the sun. He turned his horse and followed. The trail led him through canyons and dry washes, past petroglyphs carved into stone long before his time. As he rode deeper, the world grew quieter, as though sound itself had been swallowed. The air thickened. Even his horse began to resist, ears laid back. Then he saw it. An old mining camp, long abandoned, its wooden shacks collapsed in on themselves. Rusted tools lay scattered, and a broken wheel half buried in sand turned slowly in the breeze. He dismounted and walked among the ruins. There were signs of recent footprints, not the broad prints of boots, but smaller ones, bare and faint. The woman's? He couldn't be sure. He followed them through the dust until they ended at a narrow cave opening behind a ridge of rock. The charm at his chest vibrated, faint but steady, as if urging him forward. He hesitated at the mouth of the cave. The air that drifted out was cool but smelled faintly of smoke and earth. He stepped inside. The light faded quickly, swallowed by the dark. His hand brushed the wall as he moved, feeling carvings cut deep into the stone. Spirals, shapes of eyes, and what looked like figures kneeling before something vast. The farther he went, the louder the sound became, a soft whisper rising and falling like distant breath. And then he heard her voice. It came from deep within the cave, soft, trembling, and unmistakable. "Please," she said. "Don't come closer," he froze. "Where are you?" he called out. Her answer came after a pause. "You shouldn't be here." "It's watching." He turned slowly, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, yet the air seemed alive, thick with unseen weight. "I came for you," he said quietly. "Tell me what this is." "What did I touch?" She stepped from the darkness then, pale and thin, her eyes strange, too bright, too knowing. "It's older than any of us," she whispered. "It sleeps beneath the ground." The charm kept it still, bound it. "You broke that bond when you touched it." He took a step closer. "Then we can bind it again." She shook her head, tears glinting in the dim light. "No, it doesn't want to be bound. It wants to remember." "Remember what?" Her gaze dropped to the ground. Everything that was taken from it. The land, the people, the voices that once sang its name. Before he could speak again, the cave shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. A sound rose, a low hum that grew into a deep vibration echoing through his bones. The walls seemed to pulse, the carvings glowing faintly with the same spiral light as the charm. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "You can't stop it now," she said. "But maybe you can change what it becomes." Then the light flared, blinding him. He felt himself thrown backward, the ground vanishing beneath his feet. When he came to, he was lying outside the cave, the sun dipping low. The charm was still around his neck, but now the spiral carved into it burned with faint red light. The cave behind him had sealed, solid rock where an opening had been, and the woman was gone again. He stood slowly, his body aching. From somewhere in the distance, the cry of a hawk pierced the air. He turned toward the sound and saw smoke rising from the direction of Dry Creek. His chest tightened. Whatever had been awakened wasn't staying buried. By the time he reached the ridge overlooking the town, dusk had fallen. The wind was high, carrying dust and faint whispers through the air. Down below, lanterns flickered in the streets. People were shouting. The church bell was ringing again, though its rope swung untouched. Shadows flickered in the windows, shapes that didn't move like people. At the edge of town near the well stood the woman's father. He held his rifle and was shouting orders to a small group of men, their faces pale with fear. "It's the Apache," he yelled. "He brought this on us." The Apache stayed hidden, his heart pounding. He wanted to go down there to explain, but the charm began to thrum violently, so hard it hurt his chest. The air around him thickened. Then he saw it, rising from the far side of town, dark and shapeless like smoke made solid. It moved slow, stretching long fingers of shadow that reached across rooftops. Wherever it touched, light went out, screams followed. He gripped the charm, desperate, and it flared with a harsh, blinding light. For a moment, the shadow recoiled, shrinking back, but the effort drained him. He fell to one knee, gasping. The whispering grew louder, hundreds of voices overlapping. From the street below, the woman's father looked up and saw him on the ridge, the light still glowing faintly from his chest. Rage took over fear. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the valley, and the Apache staggered back, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He fell to the ground, pain flaring, the charm still burning against his skin. When he looked up again, the shadow had vanished, but so had the town's light. The night fell heavy, deep, and unnatural. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the faint image of the woman, standing beside the well, her eyes distant and sorrowful, her lips moving as if to say something he couldn't hear. He reached out to her, but his strength failed. The wind rose again, howling through the valley, carrying the echoes of lost voices and the faint toll of the church bell. And somewhere in that storm, the land itself seemed to breathe, waiting for what would come next. The Apache woke to the sound of his own breath, harsh and ragged in the dark. The earth beneath him was cold, damp with night dew. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, and when he touched it, his fingers came away slick with blood. The memory of what had happened returned in fragments. The fire in the sky, the shadow spreading through the town, the rifle's flash from below. He pushed himself upright and looked toward Dry Creek. The valley was silent. No lamps burned, no sound carried from the streets. Even the wind had gone still. Only the church bell swung faintly in the breeze, though no one stood near it. He stared at it for a long time, unease crawling up his spine. Then he looked down at the charm hanging from his neck. The faint spiral light still glowed, dim but steady, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He needed to reach the town, but his body was weak. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and bound the wound tight, gritting his teeth. The horse that had carried him lay a few paces away, spooked but alive. With effort, he climbed into the saddle and guided the animal down the slope. The air grew thicker the closer he came to the edge of town. It carried a strange weight, a heaviness that pressed on his chest. As he rode through the outskirts, he saw what the night had done. The wind had torn shingles from roofs, doors hung from broken hinges, and wagon wheels were scattered across the road. The air smelled faintly of ash and iron. But what struck him most was the stillness, an unnatural quiet, as though every sound had been swallowed. He dismounted near the well and tied the horse to the rail. The ground there was marked with deep impressions, as if something massive had moved through the earth itself. He crouched and touched one of the marks. The soil was warm, pulsing faintly beneath his palm, the same rhythm as the charm against his chest. He pulled his hand back quickly and rose, his eyes darting toward the church at the end of the road. Its doors were open now, creaking softly in the wind that shouldn't have been there. He took one cautious step forward, then another. Each sound echoed too loudly in the still air. When he reached the steps of the church, he paused, listening. From inside came a faint murmur, voices low and rhythmic like prayer. He pushed the door open. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, trembling shadows across the pews. The townspeople were there, dozens of them kneeling, heads bowed, faces pale. Their lips moved in unison, whispering something he couldn't understand. At the altar stood the woman's father, his hands clasped tight around the rifle's barrel. He turned as the Apache entered, his eyes hollow, almost vacant. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly. The Apache's voice came low. "Where is she?" The man didn't answer at first. His gaze dropped to the charm glowing faintly against the Apache's chest. "That thing," he said, his voice trembling. "You brought it here. You woke it." "I didn't know what it was," the Apache said. "You knew enough to leave it buried." The man snapped, his voice breaking. "Now look at them, look at what's left." The people behind him swayed, still murmuring, still lost in their strange prayer. The air in the church pulsed with heat. The Apache felt the charm grow hotter against his skin, as though reacting to their voices. "Tell me where she is," he said again. The man's eyes flicked toward the altar. "She came here last night," he whispered. "Said she could stop it, said the land was calling. Then the light came from the hills and she was gone. Just gone." The Apache stepped closer. The candles shuddered, their flames bending inward as though pulled by an unseen wind. "She's still here," he said softly. "I can feel it." The man shook his head, backing away. "No, what you feel isn't her. It's what took her." The moment the words left his mouth, the floorboards shivered. The candles went out one by one, plunging the church into near darkness. The air grew heavy, filled with the faint hum of something vast and unseen. Then a voice, soft, distant and familiar, whispered through the dark. "You shouldn't have come back." The Apache turned sharply. At the far end of the church, where the altar met the wall, a faint light flickered. And there she was, the woman, her face pale, her eyes filled with something that wasn't entirely human. She looked at him as if seeing through him, her voice trembling as she spoke again. "It's too late now. You opened the way." He stepped forward, but the floor beneath him creaked and split. The man with the rifle shouted, but his voice was lost in the rising roar that filled the air. The people kneeling began to cry out, clutching their heads as the church walls trembled. "Stop it!" the Apache shouted. "Tell me how to stop it." The woman shook her head slowly. "It doesn't stop. It remembers. Every drop of blood, every promise broken. It remembers all of it." The ground beneath the altar burst open, a wave of dust and air rushing upward. The candles flared back to life, burning blue now, their light twisting across the walls. From the pit rose a shadow, taller than any man, shifting and formless, its surface moving like smoke and water. The people screamed. The Apache stumbled back, shielding his face from the wind that poured out of the hole. The woman's father raised his rifle and fired, but the bullet passed through the thing like mist. The shadow moved toward him, and in an instant he was gone, swallowed without a sound. The others tried to run, but the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The Apache reached for the charm, gripping it tight. It burned against his palm, searing his skin, but he didn't let go. The light from it flared brighter, pushing back the dark for a heartbeat. In that flash, he saw faces, hundreds of them floating in the smoke. Old faces, ancient, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent cries. The woman's voice came again, closer now. "It's their memory you carry. It won't release you." He turned toward her. "Then help me fight it." She looked at him for a long moment, something flickering behind her expression. Fear, sorrow, maybe hope. "If I do," she said, "it will take both of us." Before he could answer, the floor gave way. He fell, the world tilting, the light spinning into a blur of dust and flame. He landed hard in darkness, the breath knocked from his lungs. When he looked up, he saw the faint glow of the charm still burning against his chest. And above him, the shadow filling the broken space of the church like a living storm. The woman's voice drifted through the dark again, soft and near. This land was never meant to rest. Too much blood soaked into it. Too many souls lost. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. "Then I'll give it mine if that's what it takes." The charm pulsed once more, stronger now, the light spreading across his skin like fire beneath glass. The whispering voices rose around him, swirling in the dark. He could feel the presence pressing closer, trying to pull him apart from the inside. Through the chaos, he saw her again, standing near the pit, her face half lit by the blue fire. "If you let it take you," she said, "it won't stop there. It will spread, every town, every soul." He gritted his teeth, fighting the pain that burned through him. "Then tell me what to do." Her voice broke as she spoke. "You can't destroy it, only return it to where it came from. The bond has to be complete again, by choice, not by accident." The meaning struck him like a blade. The charm, the curse, the connection between them. It wasn't meant to be broken by force. It had to be given. The walls of the church cracked, dust raining down as the shadow rose higher, filling the air with the sound of wailing. The townspeople huddled near the pews, crying out prayers that went unanswered. The Apache staggered toward the altar, his legs weak, his vision blurring. The woman reached for him, her hand trembling. "If you do this," she said, "you won't come back." He met her eyes. "Then neither will it." Before she could stop him, he pressed the charm into the earth where the pit had opened. The light exploded outward, blinding, white and hot, cutting through the darkness. The shadow screamed, not in rage but in pain, and the sound shook the valley. The wind roared through the town, tearing shingles from roofs, lifting dust and debris into the air. The bell rang again, louder this time, echoing for miles. The ground split wider, the light pouring upward like a river of fire. The woman cried out his name, her voice lost in the storm. He could feel himself slipping, his strength fading, the pull of the charm dragging him down. The air shimmered around them, and for a moment, everything froze, the church, the light, the world itself caught in a breath, and then came silence. The Apache stood in the center of the storm, the charm glowing brighter than ever. The woman reached for him, tears in her eyes, but before she could reach his hand, the ground gave way again, swallowing them both in light. The sound of the bell faded, leaving only the wind whispering through Dry Creek, soft, distant, and uncertain, as the dust began to fall. The morning broke soft and pale over the red ridge, and for the first time in many days, there was no sound of gunfire, no cries echoing from the hills. The air carried only the low murmur of wind through the cottonwoods and the slow dripping of dew from the eaves of the cabin. The Apache stood on the porch, still as stone, the faint light brushing across his face, showing the deep lines of weariness and sorrow carved there. His eyes drifted toward the valley, where the dust from the riders had long since settled, leaving behind silence and the faint trace of smoke from a dying campfire. Inside the cabin, she stirred awake, the same young woman whose cry had stopped him days ago, whose trembling voice had spoken the words that changed his fate. "You touched something." The words still echoed in his mind like a bell that refused to stop ringing. He hadn't understood it then, not fully. But now, as the sun crawled up over the ridge, he knew it wasn't her he had touched. It was something deeper, something bound to both their worlds, and something neither of them could ever undo. The small room smelled of pine smoke and the faint sweetness of wild sage. She sat up, wrapping the thin blanket around her shoulders, her eyes finding him through the open door. For a long moment neither spoke. The quiet between them was thick, not of fear anymore, but of something heavier, the weight of choices that could not be taken back. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she said softly. He didn't answer right away. His hand brushed the old rifle leaning by the door, not as a threat but a memory. "There's no staying," he finally said. "Not for me. The land doesn't forget." She looked down, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the table. "And what about me? You think the land forgets what I did?" He turned then, the light falling full on his face. "You didn't bring this," he said quietly. "It came long before you." The fire in the hearth had burned to ash, but a faint warmth still lingered. She rose, stepping closer to him. The sight of his worn hands, the scars across his knuckles, made her chest tighten. "You saved me," she said. "But now I feel like I'm the one who doomed you." He shook his head slowly. "There's no doom," he said. "Only what's meant to be." But even as he said it, his gaze drifted past her to the far wall, where his mother's old talisman hung, a small piece of polished stone wrapped in deerskin. It had been broken the night he first found her in the creek, shattered when their hands touched. That was when she cried those words, and that was when the strange silence fell over his people's camp. For days after, the elders said the spirits had turned their faces away. The wind carried no signs, the river ran dry in parts, and even the birds avoided the high ridges. The old ones spoke of balance lost, of something sacred disturbed by human touch, and deep down he had believed them. Now, standing in that cabin with her eyes fixed on him, he felt that truth pressing in again. What had begun as chance had become destiny. Outside, the day brightened. Far off, the riders from the town would soon begin their way back, searching for her, or maybe for him. Word would spread about the Apache who took in a settler girl, about what it meant, about the curse the elders whispered of. There would be no peace in staying. He moved toward the door, his boots whispering against the old boards. She followed, her voice breaking the stillness once more. "Tell me what happens now." He paused, hand on the frame, eyes distant. "Now," he said, "the land remembers us both." The words hung between them like a vow, soft and final. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the creek where it wound between the stones below the cabin. He stepped out into the light, his figure strong and solemn against the brightening valley. She watched him walk to the edge of the bluff, where the world seemed to fall away. The wind caught his hair, carrying it behind him like dark smoke. Something stirred in her, a feeling she couldn't name, caught between fear and longing. She wanted to call after him, to ask him to stay, but her throat tightened. It wasn't her place to keep him, not after everything that had happened. Some things belong to the earth, not to people. He turned once just before the ridge. Their eyes met for the last time. There was no anger in his gaze, no regret, only that deep, quiet sorrow of a man who had seen too much and lost even more. Then he was gone, swallowed by the light and dust. For a long time she stayed there, the sound of the wind her only company. The air felt different somehow, lighter but emptier too. She looked down at her hands, the same ones that had touched his all those days ago. Her fingertips tingled faintly, like the echo of something sacred, something that had changed her forever. She knelt by the doorway, tears blurring her vision. "You touched something," she whispered again, this time to the wind. "And so did I." The days that followed were quiet. She stayed in the cabin, tending to the small garden he'd planted, fixing the roof he'd patched so carefully. The townsfolk eventually came, their voices low with questions and suspicion. She told them little, only that he had gone and that the mountain had claimed him. They never found his trail. Some said he went back to his people. Others whispered that he vanished into the hills, taken by spirits or the storm. But she knew the truth. He had become part of the land itself. The ridge where he last stood grew thick with wild sage, and when the wind passed through it, it carried a sound faint and low, almost like a human sigh. Years later, long after the town had changed and the world had moved on, she would still visit that ridge. She grew older, her hair silvering like the light on the creek, but her steps never faltered. Every time she stood there, she felt him close, not as a ghost, but as something living in the soil and wind. And in those moments, she would remember the fear and wonder of that first night, the spark that had crossed between them, and the strange truth she could never explain. She had touched something she wasn't meant to, and so had he. It wasn't a curse, not really, it was a reminder that every heart, no matter how different, beats with the same ache for belonging. As twilight fell one last time, she stood on that same ridge, her gaze sweeping across the valley. The land was quiet again and at peace. She smiled faintly, her voice a whisper the wind could carry. "You lost your soul that day," she said softly. "But maybe that's how we both found ours." The light faded, and the world seemed to hold its breath. For a brief shining moment, it felt as though the land itself bowed to her. The trees still, the air heavy with memory. Then slowly, the first star appeared above the ridge, steady and pure. Down by the creek where the moonlight touched the water, something shimmered, a faint glint of stone wrapped in weathered deerskin. The talisman he once carried had found its way home, and the wind, rising gently from the hills, carried the sound of his voice once more, not in words, but in the hush of the world that had finally forgiven them both. The story of the Apache and the woman became a whisper told around campfires and porches, passed through time not as a tale of sorrow, but as one of understanding, how two souls from different worlds met beneath a rising sun and changed the valley forever. It was said that those who walked that ridge at dawn could still hear the echo of her cry, soft, distant, and filled with awe. "You touched something," she had said, and maybe, after all those years, they both had.